author of the Drug Data Decoded newsletter, Euan Thomson, joined us on the podcast to talk about everything from Alberta's compassionate intervention strategy to what he thinks safer supply should look like, to why he thinks our homelessness crisis is so out of control. But before we get into it, what's up? My name's Dan, podcaster, keynote speaker, and advocate, and I'm joined in studio by my wife and co-host Donna, and this is Hard Knocks Talks, your addictions podcast. If you're interested in fostering productive conversations about substance use in your community, organization, or event, reach out to me at daniel@hardknockstalks.com to learn more about our public speaking options. And with that, let's get into our talk with Euan Thomson.
This is Hard Knocks Talks.
What's up, Euan? How are you?
I'm doing okay. A little slow this week from the beating I took from the cops a week ago, but I'm all right and happy to be here with you. Thanks so much for having me in.
Yeah, of course. We are both, Donna and I are fans of your work. It's important work that you're doing, and we're grateful to have you. And hopefully this initiates a conversation that can be ongoing over time. It's not often that you can find media sources that are detached from the main media, detached, or take a deeper dive, I guess you could say. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that would be fair and borderline dissent.
Yeah.
So
let's jump right in. First of all, why don't we take just give us a moment? Why do you do this? Why? What's your why? Why is this important to you?
Well, I've been around drugs since I was a young kid, more or less. Moved to Calgary in the late '90s, and it's just been kind of a part of my ecosystem since I was quite young. So I've always been more or less comfortable around drugs and people who use them, and I feel a lot of kinship with people who use drugs. I myself consider myself a drug user, whether or not I'm using legal or illegal drugs. I've kind of had a long-standing comprehension that it's not the legality that makes drugs safe or unsafe. In fact, making them illegal renders them unsafe in most cases. So this is kind of the main central point that I try and push against in addressing some of the information and misinformation that comes from, particularly from the top down, from our government levels. So that's where I really focus.
Mm-hmm. So let's jump into the latest buzzword. Well, maybe not the latest, but one that's been thrown around over the past few years in the media is the Portugal model. Now we've heard the BC government and the Alberta government use this language and using it to reflect the strategies that they're trying to implement or that they are implementing. Can you unpack that just even briefly for us? Like, what is the Portugal model, and what is it that the Alberta and the British Columbia government are doing that simply aren't that?
Yeah, the Portugal model is a really comprehensive infrastructure for addressing drug use in society. It was very effective in 2001, according to the data that came out over the years following it. And a central component of it was decriminalization of drug possession and drug use, for that matter. And really what that means is decriminalization of people who use drugs. And so, around that, they built a lot of treatment infrastructure so that people had treatment on demand, more or less. And they removed any necessary sort of forced compulsory treatment as well. So these are the two big red flags that we see in Western Canada when political leaders bring up the Portugal model, and particularly in Alberta. What we see is that they're saying, "Oh, we're following the Portugal model. We're going to be applying this," and we've spoken to their infrastructure, architects and so on over there. The two things they often leave out are the two most central pieces to the Portugal model. Number one, decriminalization of people who use drugs, and number two, we don't force people into treatment. We just make it available so it's there when they want it. And short of those two things, you're not doing the Portugal model, and no amount of propaganda can change that fact. So this is something that I think more people should be pushing back against.
So on that point, recently I saw an interview of Garth Mullins following BC's sort of walking back of the decriminalization, but specifically the component recriminalizing use of substances in the public sort of parks and different things of that nature. So I'm wondering, from a public perspective, that's a scary thing, watching people use in public. And so I'm wondering, how do you feel about people using publicly in parks and on buses and different things? And then to that point, like there is a safety component there for the public at large.
Yeah. Um, yeah, this is so front of mind for me, Donna. Safety, the idea of safety right now is really being weaponized by the powers that be. So, I was just at the University of Calgary encampment protest standing with the students where we got overrun by riot police. About 100 of them that came at us with batons and riot shields and tear gas and bullets and rubber bullets and so on and so forth. And I got beaten quite badly there on account of the university feeling unsafe about my presence on their grounds, joining a peaceful protest. Um, the idea that we were creating an unsafe environment is ludicrous at best, but really quite dangerous at worst. And um,
Mm.
by that, I mean that safety is a relative concept. So somebody who is unhoused and has no other place to use drugs uses in public, and that's actually a harm reduction method for them in a lot of cases, because if somebody finds them and is able to reverse an overdose, they've just saved their lives. So they've just made that person more safe in the plainest terms. So the idea that we all are made unsafe by seeing drug use is actually a bit of a dangerous idea. I think that has really been mainstreamed over the last few years, particularly by police like Dale McPhee in Edmonton, by prominent politicians who want to drum this idea in that people who use drugs in public are unsafe inherently, and that confers a lot of power to those political parties and people that control that control these narratives, because they need to be able to justify taking action and using, in some cases, very extreme force against these people in order to displace them, move them elsewhere.
Mhm.
And we can get into the reasons for that, but in a lot of cases, there's a profit motive behind that.
Mhm.
Mhm. So hang on a sec now. Um, I think it's safe to assume that you don't think people using in public is necessarily like the gold standard of safety. Certainly, we're advocating for better systems of care. Is that accurate?
I think at the end of the day, it's best not to see public drug use, in the same way that we don't want broken beer bottles lying around or cigarette butts lying around. I think
Right.
we don't want needles either hanging out in public spaces. It's just not good for anybody.
Hmm.
And it is a public nuisance. I don't dispute that fact at all. But the idea that people can't exist in public when they're using drugs is, it's, first of all, almost impossible to control. But second of all, if we're not building housing and providing people safe spaces to use, then that's a failure on society, not on those people.
Hmm.
Mhm.
I would say that that's a policy failure, not a personal failure.
Yeah.
Because certainly, I mean, and I don't have the lived experience that Donna has necessarily, but um, using in public would to me be sort of a last resort. Like I don't think that I would want my misery or my whatever that is on display, right? Like I don't think anybody wants to be seen on the side of the road doing these kinds of things.
Well, and I agree with that. I mean, we in Saskatoon, certainly we've seen a significant increase in people sleeping rough and using openly. And that just speaks to the fact that we have a significant problem with accessible housing. There's no denying that. Um, but what I'm kind of wondering and this is getting into the sort of realm of folks with high acuity. So I don't know if you can speak to this at all, but I'm wondering, how do we address situation with folks who have significant mental health coupled with substance use disorder, who are a potential danger to themselves and others, or who are also at an increased risk of suffering violence themselves due to these compounding factors? So in those sort of situations, would you disagree with a compassionate intervention? And
Yeah, I'd say
before you get in, can you maybe just explain a little bit more what is a compassionate intervention as well?
yeah. So that phrase that you used, a danger to themselves or others, is really central to it, and it's used frequently by
Mhm.
politicians trying to advance these policies. So compassionate intervention essentially is a bit of a euphemism for forcing people into treatment. So compulsory or mandatory addiction treatment in particular, and usually it means a residential, a spell in residential treatment. Now, the things we know about forced interventions like this are not good. The evidence is pretty clear now over several systematic reviews of the literature that compassionate intervention or forced treatment, whatever you want to call it, actually puts people at higher risk of death by overdose. And this is exacerbated by the fact that the drug supply has become so much more toxic. I mean, people surviving the toxic drug supply right now are already having a hard time with that. If you combine that with an increased risk of resulting from somebody having had their tolerance to opioids stripped away from them over a course of a withdrawal and forced abstinence spell, that puts them at a pretty extreme risk. And this has been studied around the world now. Um, we know that it doesn't work to save lives, and if saving lives is the key thing we're trying to solve right now and address, then using this method is only going to exacerbate the crisis that we're in.
Mm.
Mhm.
So that's the fundamental reason why I disagree with forcing people into treatment. But the sort of corollary to it is that in most cases, probably all cases, I would argue, um, other options have not been presented to those people. So
Mhm.
they haven't been offered housing in a lot of cases. They haven't been offered food security in a lot of cases, if we're talking about somebody who's unhoused. They haven't been given adequate mental health supports. We
Mhm.
don't have good regulated addiction counseling, for example, in
No.
Alberta,
Mm.
um, and in most provinces, I would argue as well.
Mhm.
And they haven't been offered safe supply, for example. They haven't been offered an off ramp from the unregulated illegal fentanyl supply if they're using that, or other illegal unregulated drugs.
Mm.
And without those soft landings for people, we're basically expecting them to make a crash landing and somehow survive that. And it's not fair to those people. So I would always argue for an expansion of options for people before even discussing the idea of compassionate intervention, because to me that just looks like incarceration by another name.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, but I guess and you did mention some things there, but what I think, and I think Donna's sort of wondering as well, is there a place where that people can come to when they become and I know it's a buzzword that you just mentioned, when people come to a place that they are a danger to themselves or others. Do you think that there is a place where it comes to a level where somebody needs to intervene in a way that might be against this person's will in that moment?
We have that already under the Mental Health Act. So we actually don't need to expand that capability. The reason that governments are rushing to try and advance these quote unquote compassionate intervention acts is because they have failed so miserably in addressing those other options that I listed.
Mhm.
And really, that's at the root of the problem right now. And this goes to every level of government. We're talking municipal all the way to federal. With the war on public housing that we've been waging as a neoliberal society for the last 40 plus years, um, all of these things are really interconnected. And until we can start to have these holistic discussions about restoring the rights to housing, food security, safe drug supplies, all these sorts of things, then we can't start talking about forcing people into treatment, because that itself is a breach of human rights. I mean, there's legal experts that have looked at this and studied it and said, there's probably somewhere north of 500,000 people in the world right now who are in compulsory treatment, and
Mm-hmm.
probably all of them are having their human rights violated under the UN Declaration of Human Rights.
Mm.
Mhm.
So, do you believe that as well? With what do you think that every single detainment, when it comes to either substance use or the harms that come from substance use, say someone is using and they are using where they shouldn't be, or they're acting in a way that is not appropriate in whatever, do you think every single one of those detainments is a human rights violation?
It is if other options have not been presented and pursued first. And
Okay.
I do, I'm not an expert on the Mental Health Act, so I think that there probably are cases where short-term detainment is needed to keep somebody safe and keep people around them safe. But long-term detainment to me is just entirely political.
Yeah, yeah. And what should be on the other side of that short-term detainment, in your opinion? Because I mean, we do have a wellness center opening here in Saskatoon, complex needs shelter, I believe they called it, where they will be detaining people for 24 hours, like something like that, under certain circumstances. Now, those are yet to be determined, and I have my concerns about who sets the benchmark for who goes in there and who doesn't. But what do you think should happen after these short detainments, like after 24 hours? If you're just going to turn someone loose back into the environment they came from, I can't imagine that much. I can't imagine that being a productive way to go. What do you think?
Yeah, you get a lot of people complaining about sort of catch and release policing. This is something that comes up often, and I don't agree with catch and release policing either. I don't actually agree with most policing in this context, actually. But I would say if those people aren't being offered a list of options coming out of that 24-hour detainment, here we have housing ready for you. Here, this is where you can access the local food bank. Not great option, but it's something. It's what we've got. Here is a doctor who's going to hook you up with safe supply for a period, and if you feel like in 6 months you're ready to ramp down and reduce your use or switch to methadone or something like that, like these are all things that really do work, and the data's clear on them now. Like we don't need to keep running around the same bush here. We can actually start to implement these at scale with the confidence that they are going to have public safety impacts. They're going to have public health impacts. They're going to have personal impacts for the individuals who can then get their feet under them, reconnect with family, do all the sorts of things that we're seeing in these safe supply pilots across Canada. But for a larger number of people who need access. So I think that I think most people are on the same page that the catch and release, quote unquote, policing is not a solution, and
certainly not a
neither
healthcare
is long-term
solution.
detainment. No, and I even push back against the idea that this is necessarily a health crisis in a lot of cases. Like so many times, it's just an issue of people's basic social needs not being met, which really reframes it as a social crisis rather than a health or a criminal justice one.
So, excuse me, one of your articles you're talking about with drug court, given a choice between incarceration and treatment, and I think this kind of expands upon what you were just discussing there. From a public perspective, I suspect a lot of people are saying, "Well, what's wrong with that?"
Yeah. Again, we're narrowing the scope of options to only 2 when there really should be a dozen. Unfortunately, our social safety net has eroded so severely over the last 40 years, with multiple federal, conservative and liberal governments in succession, whittling away at that social safety net. Everything from healthcare to Social Security, to wages and housing. It really is at the root of the crisis that we're seeing in terms of people seeming to be stuck in a cycle. These are not inevitable cycles that we're seeing play out. They are preventable, and they were preventable a long time ago. Unfortunately, we're seeing the fallout of many decades of really bad policy that has created a huge amount of disparity. We are dealing with people who have billions of dollars now, while they kind of lord over the cities and push unhoused people out of public spaces in order to develop those spaces into newly profitable enterprises. This is the crisis, and this is what people, I think, need to bond together and fight back against at the end of the day here.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned a moment ago, and I want to talk a bit about your opinions on safe supply. You mentioned that being prescribed a safe supply should be an option when somebody is going to re-enter the community after a short stay and whatever that looks like. What are your thoughts on safe supply? Do you believe that it should be of a medical model, or do you believe that a safe supply should be available not unlike alcohol is currently available?
I think that, I'll say right up front, I work in the alcohol industry. I work in alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverage production. So I feel that in some ways, I think the horse has left the barn, but alcohol for the last 100 years has probably been too widely available for people.
Thank you.
Prohibition clearly didn't work.
Yeah.
But we swung really far to the kind of corporate model on the other side of that,
Yeah.
and I don't think that was necessary either. At the same time, I don't want to see us necessarily follow alcohol down that path with other drugs. I don't think that's productive, but I do think we need to come a long way back from the prohibitionist era that we're sitting in right now, that we've been in since about 1907.
Yeah.
And I don't think that necessarily needs to look like a medical model. I think what we've got is some pretty good evidence now from the Drug User Liberation Front in Vancouver that community can look after itself in this context using a nonprofit compassion club based model. That sounded absolutely ludicrous in the 90s when cannabis compassion clubs were being set up, and I think to a lot of people it sounds ludicrous now with the heroin, methamphetamine, cocaine ones being set up, but they do work. And if you take the profit motive out of it, it's really powerful for shoring up community and having people look after each other and themselves, rather than having this essentially a turf war going on between medical prescribers and illegal vendors.
Mm-hmm. And I've said many times on the show that, when I go to my son's football event or something like that, I don't want to see big inflatable beer cans. I don't want to see alcohol being sold by chicks in
That are barely 19.
yeah, in little tennis skirts and
Just perpetuating.
But I mean, if you
so many
think
things.
like let's think about that for a minute now, and some do advocate for just an open, safe supply, and what would that look like? Like, would we go to a football game and see like giant inflatable shady 80s and like shards of meth and like what is that?
That's a bit extreme, but
Oh yeah, well it is, but I mean that's what we're doing with alcohol.
true.
Right.
Very
So,
true.
and if people are advocating for the safe consumption of now illicit substances in the same way that we now have alcohol regulated, like that, as a parent and as a human being on this planet, that provides like, I'm a little bit anxious about that. So
yeah, as somebody that operates, in the corporate sector, I can tell you, advertisement in general is poison for the brain. It's a way to make people make irrational decisions about where to spend their money and how to treat their body and so on and so forth. So advertisement in really every context is bad for society. If it's about informing people about something that is not profit motivated, then great. Then that's important. That's sharing information. Advertising is not sharing information. It's trying to make you make an irrational decision. So I think that when you put that in the context of drug use, it is one of the most insidious. It is one of the most insidious forces in society, and I think that it's probably the number one thing I would target in terms of addressing any kind of drug use policy. If we were going to roll something back, it would be, target advertising. It was effective with cigarettes. It was effective, in Formula One. And I don't think we need to go down the road of putting awful images on cigarette cartons that are really just going to make people feel like monsters. I think we just need to start by removing some of the advertising capabilities and capacities, and that will go a long way on its own.
I agree with that. I mean, I recently, about a year ago, started vaping, but I do recall when they rolled out those pictures on the cigarette packs. I'm like, who is this for? This does not make me scared to smoke. It's too late. So yeah, and then just the trillions of dollars that go into marketing campaigns and the psychology behind it is really, that money could be better spent in sort of awareness campaigns of the dangers, something more proactive and productive. But that's just my 2 cents on that front.
Yeah, it's the first step towards criminalizing people, really. If you think of criminalization as the deepest form of stigmatization, I think any form of stigma is leading closer and closer to criminalization and helping to justify that sort of action against people. So I always recoil when I see stigmatizing language, imagery, any of that sort of thing. And particularly when it's publicly funded, I think that's really problematic. And I think it's, just in terms of like thinking about conflict of interest in this context as well. I think you're going to see a lot of pushback from alcohol, big alcohol producers, as other drugs sort of approach decriminalization and legalization eventually, and regulation. Alcohol producers have a lot to lose from allowing other drugs into the legal market. And this is where I get a little bit bothered, but people will kind of come at me for like being like, oh, you're in the alcohol industry, you shouldn't be speaking on this. It's like, this is an opposite of the conflict of interest. I literally stand to lose by advocating for an end to the toxic drug crisis, because it will affect the economy of the alcohol market. And I'm very comfortable with that fact. I think that it needs to happen. And if we want to talk about businesses being able to operate safely in downtown spaces, for example, one of the key parameters that needs to be adjusted within that is drug legalization, drug criminalization. So, everybody's tired of hearing about gang violence and murders on account of all that stuff. We don't need it. It's not inevitable. We don't have to have drug-driven gang violence in our society. We can just legalize and regulate, and then figure out how to control that however we want to. So yeah, I think that there's so much to say around conflict of interest, and if we have time, I'd love to get more into that.
We've got time.
We've got time.
So,
Definitely.
But before you have a question, I'm assuming you got one queued up.
I just forgot what it was because you completely came at me.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'm going to read the sponsors off, and then we'll get into that. Okay. Today's sponsors: Pine Lodge Treatment Center. The center I went to treatment 7 years ago when I got sober, offers inpatient addictions treatment and aftercare programming in Regina, Saskatchewan. To inquire about services or make a donation, call 306-510-1891 or find their link in the description below. Are you affected by someone else's drug use? Family and friends can be okay and do recover. Naranon can help. Contact Ronnie at 306-731-7573 for meeting information. You can also find a link in the comment section, or in the show description. I'm thrown off. This is just like, it's kind of humorous to me. I can't help it, but like, here we go. This episode is sponsored by Dr. Barb Hornsler from the School of Public Health.
We love you, Barb.
We love you, Barb. It's amazing. This is the very first episode that's ever been sponsored by a person, like not like an organization, but just like a person that's like... So anyway, sorry. Dr. Barb supports evidence-based drug policy and investigative journalism to keep the public informed. Due to the disseminated landscape of journalism in Canada and the prevalence of ideological policy, supporting initiatives like Drug Data Decoded serves our democratic interests and promotes system transparency. Free and informed debate builds healthier communities and is the backbone of public health. Keep doing the good work, Euan.
Hells yeah.
Barb.
Thanks so much, Barb. That's so
Barb,
nice.
I want you to use more big words in the next one, like ideological. That's a fun one for Dan. But and she says hashtag fangirl at the bottom with a big smiley face that I can't show you, but yes. So thank you, Barb, for your support. You've been a ferocious supporter, I would even go as far to say, since nearly the very beginning. So thank you for your ongoing support.
Absolutely. Yes.
So anyways, Donna, go ahead.
So yeah, my thought process got a little bit derailed when Dan was like, okay, your turn. What I think I was going to say is, and again, I'm going back to this sort of public perspective, because there is that limited knowledge and limited understanding, thanks to that propaganda machine that we referred to. But I think that, there might be a lot of support for this Alberta model, because what they're seeing is desperate times call for desperate measures. And so if you were to encounter somebody, how would you explain simply why that is not accurate? Does that make sense? Is that it?
I think it makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I can certainly work through that. It's a big question, but I think the first place I would start with, I think we've talked lots about the options that are needed for people. I don't think I need to go into that. Like, those options are not being provided. End of story. Alberta has put in a massive effort, the Alberta government, to make sure that those options are not on the table for people. And there are profit motives behind that. And I'll get into that. On the personal, like individual level, something that I often talk to businesses about, and I this business coalition up here is there's a bunch of Saskatoon Regina businesses are members of this, and they'll carry naloxone on site as sort of the starting point of how to look after their neighbors and kind of create a community around them that is just a little bit safer than it was before. But there's more to that, and I would say number one on that list is having people able to de-escalate situations. So de-escalation training is absolutely critical in this context. If we're not going to get out of this situation of sort of desperate times and desperate measures by pointing guns at people, that's going to make this worse. And we see that play out in our streets all day long in any major city, really anywhere in the country. And so we need to remove cops from the equation as step number one to every extent that we can. Police are useful for bank robberies, hostage taking situations, maybe sort of even then we're talking about a de-escalation situation where we need somebody who's trained in that to understand how to get through and minimize casualties and loss. So calling the cops, first of all, can put somebody in immediate, sometimes permanent harm, and will generally just escalate the situation. So I would avoid that at all costs, unless all other options have been exhausted. You can prevent situations from spiraling out of control through de-escalation measures, but you can also prevent them before they even get to that point by having people know that they can come to you if they're in distress. If you run a business, for example, in a downtown area, if you get to know your neighbors, if you're offering them juice or snacks or cigarettes from time to time and getting to know their names and that sort of thing, these are all such valuable foundation building exercises for you to be a part of that community in a way that you can't be otherwise. So I think that people can just show up a little bit more for their neighbors, and you'll feel that in return. I think once you start to see that you're a safe person to be around, that they view you as a safe person to be around, and it just creates a really good framework for de-escalation later on as well. So I think that's kind of at the individual scale, but coming back to the idea of kind of the profit motive behind this, the reason that the Alberta government ran a phony supervised consumption site review in 2019 to 2020, the reason they ran a phony safe supply review in 2022 was to make sure that those things were not expanded upon in Alberta and ideally whittled back to bare bones. And that's what we're seeing with supervised consumption now in Alberta. It's what we have seen with safe supply. What little safe supply existed in this province before 2023 has been essentially eliminated. And so those options are not there for people. The only option given is private addiction treatment And that's just unfair to everybody in the system. It's unfair to healthcare providers. It's unfair to the end users. It's unfair to the general public who are not going to see the results that they're hoping for out of the public safety side of things. And the people who it's fair to are the profiteers in this system, essentially. So that's where I really push back.
Mm-hmm.
So another phrase that I came across in your articles, and it sounds lovely, but I'm sure you're going to correct us all on that. Unhoused navigation centers. What is that?
And why is it bad?
Yeah.
So in the Alberta budget for this year, there was an interesting phrase used for to the tune of $10 million. They're going to fund compassionate intervention intake centers. They never explained what those were, but you start to connect the dots between the budget and what's going on in the streets of Alberta cities, and you realize that these navigation centers, these unhoused navigation centers, are the compassionate intervention intake and assessment centers that are funded to the tune of $10 million in the Alberta budget. So the Alberta government has now spent 5 years building a framework for forced treatment of people, particularly unhoused people. This is really the target demographic that they're looking to go after. We're talking about somewhere in the range of 10,000 people in Alberta who are unhoused. And that represents a tremendous pool of clients for private addiction treatment centers. And private addiction treatment centers have stood very steadfast with the Alberta government since they started announcing the measures they were going to be taking around these sorts of policies in 2019. So these intake centers are really one of the last pieces of the puzzle to put into place so that unhoused people who are swept away from encampments have no other options. They're pushed towards these navigation centers after having their tent ripped apart and thrown in the garbage. And at that point, they might have their record search for outstanding warrants, in which case they'll wind up in the criminal justice system. They might be offered treatment. They might be offered housing, but that's always going to be tethered to treatment. It'll be conditional on their abstinence. Mm-hmm. And if they fall out of abstinence through a urine screening, they'll have that stripped away and be back on the streets is mm-hmm. kind of the general framework to all of this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And without saying too much, I certainly witness that sort of same thing happening in some of the work that I do outside of the show. A lot of the things that people have access to is contingent upon abstinence. And it's just not working. So we have so many people falling through the cracks, and from a support perspective, the burnout is incredible because you just feel like you're burning your wheels. You're spinning out, and you've got nowhere to help people connect to, and it's creating a big mess.
Mm-hmm. The moral injury of that is something I think that is really worth considering for listeners. Imagine being a firefighter or a paramedic or a social worker and thinking you were going into it to help people, and mm-hmm. your entire job just ends up being responding to overdoses, and as a social worker trying to help people who simply cannot be helped because the systems don't exist to help them. And you're watching the same
point.
People. You're watching
really
the same people come through the same cycle.
Yep.
Yeah, over and over and over again. So this is a war on people. We've talked about kind of war on housing, war on drugs. Ultimately, it's a war on people in order to extract profit from them and from the public dollar. In some cases, others it's going to be private, but it's not good for anybody. And I think that moral injury is one way that it really manifests for a broad swath of people who aren't necessarily directly affected by the substance use or houselessness themselves.
So I'm interested to understand, because these encampments that we're seeing in all of our cities, we see them everywhere. We are also aware of the happenings in these encampments. Horrible things happen, and I don't need to get into any specific details, but when you mentioned things like people getting their tents ripped down and they're being forced into these things, what is your solution? Like, do you believe that the people in these encampments should just be left alone and allowed to their own devices and to do whatever they want? Or do you think that a different level of intervention, a different level of services should be made available to move them onto a more stable path of wellness?
I think that additional supports would be a really useful way to frame this, providing, publicly. So let me back up. In 2020, in Edmonton, there was an encampment set up called Camp Euan. It was about 400 people were all camping together in the Edmonton River Valley. There, as far as I know, were no overdose deaths during the months on site there. People were looking after each other. Um, they had very little violence inside the camp. There was a tremendous amount of community. The police didn't like it, that's for sure, and the city did everything it could to tear it down over those months. But it operated for, from what I remember, about 4 to 6 months. In November of 2020, they came in and they forced them out. But yeah, to that point, I think it was kind of a good example of how I think we're applying a lot of colonial logic to the idea that people can't live in community together if they're, given just the bare bones adequate supports, access to washrooms, access to food, and the ability to look after one another. These things can actually work. That doesn't answer the question of, does anybody want this in their backyard? And I'm not really qualified to comment on that, because I think, I've been around encampments enough now that I am relatively comfortable, around them. But I understand why people aren't. I know that bad things can happen in them, and I will also say that a lot of the time that bad things happen in them, it's because of the way that they're treated. It's the way that that the violence kind of comes on down on them from the top. And I think this really comes back to the idea that people will quite often, or always in most contexts, behave in a way that's consistent with how they're treated. So if we're treating these as criminal elements, and we really get used to mainstreaming that idea, repeating those talking points from, I'm going to pick on Chief Dale McPhee in Edmonton again. Danielle Smith has done it multiple times as well. Then people, I don't see any reason why they wouldn't just sort of throw their hands up and say, okay, I guess we're criminals. Why would we behave any differently? I think we can do better than that. I think we can approach this with a little bit more humanity, and again, come in with those supportive options. Bring in the healthcare resources that people are asking for. Bring in the food security. Bring in washroom access. Just basic needs for people, and you might see things turn around pretty quickly.
I want to touch on an article that you did around coercion and how it has the potential to bring harm, in particular to youth.
Yeah, this is something that the American Bar Association has been taking a greater interest in recently, and so that's essentially a big legal institution made up of legal scholars and lawyers in the U.S. And they've been sounding the alarm about what's called the troubled teen industry in the United States. We don't really have that lexicon up here so much, but for all intents and purposes, we do have a parallel system operating in Alberta, across the prairies, and into Eastern Canada as well. One of the things they highlighted was the interchangeability of the troubled teen industry, which is really focused on addiction treatment, in particular for youth, with the juvenile detention system, which I think is really problematic in a way. If you're sort of treating addiction as an issue, and then having kids moving in and out of like addiction care because the beds aren't available in one place, and then kind of moving them into juvenile detention, then suddenly you've made addiction a criminal issue again. And apparently this is happening quite frequently down there. I worry that the same thing is coming into place in Alberta, and there is a significant history of child abuse in these systems. So we're talking about teens that are going in to these institutions that are not very well regulated, or not regulated in some cases at all. They're being pushed in there sometimes by parents who want them to undergo conversion therapy. They are being strip searched, and in some cases, like just sexually and physically abused, certainly emotionally abused.
Mhm.
And there are just countless testimonies now around this. Lawsuits ongoing. Paris Hilton is one person who's been really vocal about her experience, having been hauled into this, kidnapped in the middle of the night to be hauled into one of these centers. Just incredibly traumatic stuff for youths.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And you hear, and I had a past guest on a little while ago from down south in the States, and she was talking about how she's working in recovery high schools. And when you say recovery high schools, many of us, and many people who aren't, maybe may have the knowledge that you have or whatever, we think, wow, that sounds incredible. And to me, even, I mean, if that was done properly, wow, what a valuable resource that could be to not only reduce substance related harms in our youth, but maybe even take some preemptive measures to prevent these harms in the future. Like, do you see any value in these programs at all, or is this just all bad for you?
I have serious reservations about the idea of segregating youths who use drugs from the general population. And I think that integrating substance use supports in high schools is a great idea. I think that having services available for youths that are seeking help is really useful. But in my experience growing up and seeing friends and people in my cohort being forced into youth treatment against their will, with no real understanding that, from the youth's perspective, that this was for their own good. They didn't see it that way. This was something that was being done to them. And I have a big problem with the idea of hauling kids out of their peer circles and placing them into these segregated facilities that ultimately will potentially risk putting them into a cycle that they can't get out of, because now they're essentially labeled as people who have a substance use problem, and that could stick with them for life. In a lot of cases, youths use drugs. The parents come down very hard on them for that. The cannabis craze and scare was going on. Yeah, it's still going on with
It's
a lot of
scary,
people.
but legitimately, like, it's scary. As a parent, like, I can't help but sympathize with parents going to great measures to help them avoid the horrors that are out there on the street. So I'm just saying, like, I get it, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
Yeah, it's fair. I totally understand the fear. I just worry that the outcome isn't going to be what we're hoping for. I think in a lot of cases you'll push somebody into potentially a lifetime of trauma, first of all, because of the abuses that they may encounter in these systems that are not very well regulated, but and privately run in a lot of cases. And second of all, I think that risk of labeling people for life is really problematic for some folks. Kids use drugs. I think that's the sort of the first thing we could just all have to come to an understanding of. People use drugs, including kids. They experiment. They take risks. It's not always good. It's not easy to watch as parents. I can't even imagine. Being a parent watching me grow up, that would have been hard.
I just said to my mom the other day in her Mother's Day card, I said, "Thank you for not murdering me when I was growing up. I now see how challenging that must have been."
Yeah. There are a lot of things that my parents did that as a parent now, I'm like, oh, okay, I get it.
And I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry. Yeah. And now I'm
Totally.
sitting here praying my kids don't put me through the same.
Or that they go through the same.
Or go through the same. Exactly. Yeah. It's just
Yeah. These things are out there. The worst outcome we can have right now is, seeing 11, 12, 13-year-old kids dying because they were using unregulated fentanyl. And that's going on far too frequently right now. We can do a lot better than that. We were doing a lot better than that, even when things were, kind of dire during the height of the OxyContin phase of the crisis. 11 and 12 and 13-year-old kids were not generally dying from OxyContin overdoses during that period. It was a very, very rare thing to see something like that. Now it's kind of common, and I think that's not something that any parent wants either. So and probably less so. So I think we've gotten farther away from the answer right now, and part of that is the idea that abstinence is the only option for people. It wasn't for sex, we eventually got over that, and introduced sexual education for kids, and that's been incredibly effective as a public health and kind of just educational rights based approach. And I think we can apply similar thinking to drug use as well. So yeah, I also I've been following that standing committee in the federal parliament recently, and I've noticed the word come up really frequently. It's prevention. Has been, I think, misused a lot. Prevention, I don't think necessarily needs to only relate to stopping drug use before it happens. I think that prevention should be reframed a little bit as preventing harms associated with, in particular, unregulated drug use, but any drug use really. And I think anything that causes harm, to youths by putting them into a cycle that they can't get out of later, it is not prevention. That you may have stopped the drug use for a short period, but you've probably actually caused more harm than you've prevented. So I think we do need to reframe prevention away from stopping drug use, and think about it in terms of some of these other things we've talked about. Talking about housing security, food security, and all that. These are all real prevention methods that are proven to work for people to minimize drug harms.
What do you think? What was your first thoughts when you found out that Guy Felicella got banned from the Recovery Capital Conference?
That
Just gotta put you on
really
full screen here. I'm gonna go have a coffee. Come back in 10 minutes.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah. It really exemplified the ways that polarization is coming down from the top in these battles around drug policy right now. Guy Felicella is a perfect example of somebody who keeps a foot in both worlds, supports everybody with his entire heart and his entire being, and understands, his most fundamental point is that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for harm reduction, and he wouldn't have the quality of life he does without treatment, without recovery. And I think that the quote unquote polarization that we're seeing around, harm reduction versus recovery and so on and so forth is really well exemplified by him being banned from that, because I think the powers that be that are linked in with Recovery Conference, with Alberta Recovery, Recovery Capital Conference and so on, and the Alberta government are threatened by the idea that harm reduction could expand and really become a scaled up tool in the tool belt for people trying to survive the drug crisis. It's not right now. You people in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan know better than anybody. You don't even have a publicly funded supervised consumption site in that province. But you're funding treatment centers to the tune of hundreds of millions a year, I would guess, or at least in the range of 100 million probably. Alberta's doing 300 million a year right now for its mental health and addiction budget. Less than 30 million, less than 15 million of that is going towards supervised consumption now. So we're talking about a drop in the bucket in the overall budget. And so I think that we can do a lot better in terms of sort of dispelling this notion that polarization is somehow being created by people in the harm reduction world. I don't think that's the case. I think that they're responding to what is an active effort to suppress harm reduction as a viable option for people. And when I say that, again, I'm coming back to that list of options: safe supply, housing, food security. These are all approaches that we could be taking to prevent the harms of substance use, as well as some of those more conventional supervised consumption sites, needle exchange, needle provision, access to primary care. There's just such a long list of things that we could be doing that we're not, and all of them really fall under the umbrella of harm reduction at the end of the day.
Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to hit on before we let you go, Euan?
Yeah, I think I just leave it at I think we need to just get past the idea that everybody who uses drugs needs treatment. I think there's nothing wrong fundamentally with people who use drugs. We all use drugs to some extent or another, whether it's legal or illegal. I would argue that the sickness that we're seeing in this context is in society. The evidence for that is in the mass preventable death that we're allowing to take place on our streets and in homes. Every demographic in our society right now, and so I think let's get past the idea that we're necessarily in an addictions crisis. I think first and foremost we're in an unregulated toxic drug emergency. We can address that and help people find the addiction treatment they're seeking later.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Well put.
Tell us where can people find your work?
You can find my writing at drugdatadecoded.ca. If you're a business, you can head to eachintoevery.org and join up. You can join for free. It's just a national coalition, hundreds of businesses signed up in most provinces and territories. We're looking for advocates, people who will push back against some of these harmful narratives that businesses are made unsafe by people who use drugs. I think we can flip that narrative and really create stronger, more vibrant, and healthier, safer communities through a bit of collective action.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank
Kayla A's asking Barb questions in the chat. I guess that means it might be time to get Barb on the show again. Okay, Euan, thank you so much
Yes,
for
thank you.
joining us today. I hope you'll join us again in the future. I'm sure that there's many conversations that we could have that would be quite productive. So, but until then, we'll let you go and take care.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, there's Donna again. I got the buttons backwards. All right, if you got something out of that, please click that like button at the bottom of the screen. If you leave us a comment, leave us something in the comment section. Every engagement matters to us. Every engagement tells the algorithm that what we're doing is in fact important. We go live as much as we can. We try to go twice a week. We've got like 290 episodes for you to catch up on. You can listen to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and wherever. But that's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.